And so 2 weeks ago, we talked about we began to get into the specifics of chapter 21. When we first started discussing this chapter, we kind of started with discussing the broader topic of slavery in the Bible. And 2 weeks ago, we got into the specifics of the commands or the laws that we're getting. Now, remember, these are civil laws, not moral laws. And so by that, these are laws given to Israel for their practice as a nation. Understand that that's who they're written to. Now, the first thing we discussed is this verse 2, where it says, when you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the seventh he shall go out free for nothing, right? And so that's where we get that year of Jubilee, right? That idea of that seventh year of freedom. We discussed how that is emblematic again, or illustrative of that Sabbath idea. How God weaves the importance of the Sabbath in constantly throughout the Bible. Because at the beginning, remember, God, the Genesis talks about God creating the world in 6 days. And on the seventh, he rested. He didn't rest because he was tired, right? He rested to set a precedent of the importance of that seventh-day rest. That holy seventh day set aside, right? Mm-hmm. And then the first command, really, one of the first commands or laws that God gives to Israel is when he gives them manna, right? When he establishes manna, he says, you shall pick it up 6 days. On that sixth day, you'll get double, because on the seventh day, you rest. Even from this. And so God is constantly establishing that seventh day as a holy day set aside for him, so that you would rest, not for laziness, but out of honor, to honor that seventh day. And here we have that same idea, where the slave will labor for 6 years, but in the seventh year his labor ends. That's where he ceases to labor. The rest comes, right? And it says he will go out free for nothing. That means he will not have to pay for his freedom, either with money or with labor, or earn it in any way. It doesn't matter if you think he was a good enough slave to earn that freedom. When that seventh year comes, he goes out free for nothing. And this is to me, this has the same feeling of the idea of grace, right? Because grace is given by the will of God, not because any of us deserve it. There was nothing we did to purchase it. There is nothing you can do to earn it or to deserve it. It's given. And in the same way, the slave in that seventh year goes out free. Not because of earning it, not because of any quality of his own, not because he could afford to, none of that. Because it was the will of God. And that's all it is. That's all it is. So we talked about that. And the other thing we talked about was this idea in the verses 4 through 6, where it says, if his master gives him a wife and she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, and he shall go out alone. Now this is because the wife that he gave the slave was the master's before it was the slave's wife. And so the slave came in single, right? Came in without a wife. And if he chooses to go out free, he can go out free, but his wife, who was the master's before, will still be the master's. And the children, which came as a result of that, are also still the master's. So, the slave can go out free, but he'll have to leave his wife and children under the authority of the master. Right? Well, we'll get into a little bit of that today, but yeah, more or less, until their time of service is done. But there's a choice which comes. Verse 5, but if the slave plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free. Right? Notice, it's the expression of love which compels him to stay. The expression of love is what compels him to stay. And not just love for his wife and children, which we would expect, but the love for his master, which maybe we wouldn't expect because of our own cultural feelings about all of this, right? But there is love for the master, and that is what compels him to stay. I love my master. That says a lot about the master. Right? We talked about how, in our understanding of slavery, we often think of slavery as being a shameful thing. It's shameful to be a slave, right? Because of our history because of our history and because of our cultural values. Because in America, we make freedom into a virtue. We make freedom this quality above all others, right? American freedom, that's like America, right? That's our thing. But the Bible does not list freedom or liberty as a virtue, as some honorable quality, right? That's not the way the Bible describes it. In fact, when the Bible talks about freedom, the freedom that Christ brings, that freedom isn't the American sensibility of freedom. That freedom is now you're free to choose whom you are going to serve. And somebody might say, well, I'm not going to serve anyone. No, yes, you will. No, because you serve someone by default. Yes, that's right. Right? The natural condition is either you serve sin unto death, and until Christ, that's your only choice. That's why you're enslaved to sin, because you have no choice. But when Christ comes and redeems us and makes our spirit live, now we have a choice whether I will follow the flesh unto death, or now that I have a living spirit because of Christ, I will follow righteousness unto life. Right? That's right. And so it's who are you going to serve? That's the freedom which Christ brings us. Now Americans, we don't like that. We're like, well, how dare you? I have liberty and get out of here. Get out of here with that. The only freedom you get in Christ is who are you going to serve? And if you say, sir, I serve no one, well then by default you will stay serving sin. You will be a slave to sin. And so the Bible doesn't talk about liberty and self-dependence and independence. And the Bible doesn't talk about that as a virtue. It's a gift, but it's not a virtue. And so we have this tendency to see slavery as shameful and despicable and all that. But in the Bible, you can be perfectly honorable as a slave. You can be wonderfully righteous and admirable. A slave can be admirable by their own behavior and according to who they serve. A slave can have high honor if they're the slave of somebody with high honor. Right? If you're the slave of the ruler, of the king, then you're higher than most people who are not slaves. Because your honor, the honor of the person you serve, is reflected upon those who serve them. And that's not unusual, really. Because we think about if there's a particularly good boss, right? Then people feel privileged to be their employee. And they will brag about being their employee. They'll brag about, I have this awesome boss, right? And for them, it becomes almost a point of boasting where they can boast about, look, I've got a great boss, right? And they can boast about their boss. The honor of their boss reflects upon them. And they get honor because of who their boss is and all that kind of stuff, right? That's why Americans get so frustrated by whatever president is in power and what the president says or does, right? Because the behavior, the honor or shame of the president reflects on those who are under them, right? People who don't like Trump really don't like Trump partly because they feel it reflects upon them. People who don't like Biden really don't like Biden partly because of how it reflects upon them. Because that's the ostensible leader of our nation, and that reflects upon those who are in the nation, right? Okay. And so, for the slave can say, "I love my master," and that speaks to the quality of that person, the honor of that person. And so the slave can choose. In verse 6 it says, "Then his master shall bring him to God, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, and his master shall bore through his ear with an awl, and he shall be his slave forever." So this slave, because of the love he has for the master, the wife, and the children, can choose to serve that master forever. To forever bind himself to that person. And we talked about firstly, it's significant that he says that he will bring the master will bring that slave before God. Think about that phrasing. He will bring him before God. So, because there's a vow being made. It has that same imagery as marriage. Right? Because at least for Christians, when we marry, we make a vow before people, but really before God. We are vowing to God to be married and wed to one another and to be faithful in that commitment, in that oath, in that vow. We come before God. And that's what makes it binding, right? That's why Jesus uses that phrase that you hear in weddings all the time. What God has brought together, let no man tear asunder, right? Because it's a vow made before God. And so it's that same idea. This slave is vowing himself, like a marriage, to his master. And the master brings him before God so that they can make that vow together. Because, as we'll find out as we read through, there are responsibilities the master has to the slave, right? And so they are making this vow, right? And then, this is the ceremony, and he shall bring him to the door or the doorpost, which is interesting. Which is interesting that it's not any piece of wood. It's the door or the doorpost. Now, to me, this puts me back in mind of the Passover, right? Because they had to go to the doorway and spread the blood of the lamb. And that's what marked them as people, as God's people. This slave is being brought to the door so that he might be marked forever as the servant of this master. Right? You see that? The people of Israel needed to put a mark on their door to show themselves as servants of this master. And so in the same way, if a slave wanted to forever be marked as belonging to this master, in the same way he was brought to the doorpost, and there the mark was made. Right? Yes?
But wasn't business also carried out during those times? Wasn't it carried
Business was often carried at the gates of the city. So this would be at the master's house.
Oh, okay.
The door of the master's house, which makes sense because that's where the slave would serve, right?
Okay,
And so if you're carrying out business in a
Yeah.
city, it would make sense to go to the doorpost of that city, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so and we can give this, we can start to look at this imagery for ourselves, right? Because we are slaves of Christ, bondservants of Christ, willing slaves who, because of our love for our master, have chosen to bind ourselves forever to him, right? And what does Christ tell us? If anybody will come after me, let him do what? Pick up his cross, which is made of beams, very much like a doorway, to which we must nail our flesh. In the same way, the master shall bore his ear through with an awl. Essentially, that looks like somebody hammering a nail. They put that and pop! They nail that thing in, right?
I always thought, as a kid, I'm like, how is he supposed to work with a master?
What do you need? But in the same, it has that idea of the flesh being crucified, right? And when we follow Christ, that's what we're supposed to do, to daily crucify our flesh, right? And Christ did it first. He showed the way for us to do it, right? And then we follow him, right? If anyone would come after me, he must pick up his cross and follow me, right? We have to be bored through. We have to be bored through. And you identified a reference to this in Psalms, right? Where David writes, Lord, open my ear, right? Which many of us read that and we think, oh, he wants to hear God better. But no, it's this reference. It's this, Lord, open my ear, as far as bore it through with that awl, so that I might forever be your servant. That I might forever be marked as your slave. Because it is better, it is a higher honor to be the slave of God than to be the king of all other things. And David was a king when he said this, right? David was the king that God chose, and yet David still saw it as a higher honor to be the slave of God than the king of anything else. And so that's the imagery we have here of the slave who loves his master and must be bound to him forever. In the same way, we are to be slaves of righteousness, slaves of Christ, bound to ever, marked in the same way, with the crucifixion of our flesh and the breaking of our bodies. And that's mostly of what we talked about last week. And so